My name is Emma, and I am 32 years old. On September 6th, 2025, my parents walked out of my wedding ceremony in front of 180 guests. They didn't trip. They didn't get a phone call. They stood up, looked at me at the altar, and left. 2 chairs in the front row sat empty for the rest of the night. Every single person in that room saw it. And by the time dinner was served, my husband had made sure every single person in that room understood exactly why. But before I tell you what my husband did, you need to understand what my parents did first, because the story doesn't start at the wedding. It starts 3 years earlier, in my grandmother's living room in Kingston, Ontario, the afternoon after her funeral. My grandmother, Margaret, was 81 when she passed in March 2022. She was the kind of woman who kept a handwritten budget in a notebook she carried everywhere, who reused tinfoil, who wore the same winter coat for 20 years and still looked elegant in it. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing company in Kingston for 34 years, and she had saved with the same discipline she brought to everything else in her life. When she died, my grandfather Harold had already been gone for 6 years, and the estate she left behind was more substantial than most people expected. At the reading of the will, the family lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Okafor, explained that my grandmother had set aside a specific amount for her grandchildren. There were 2 of us, me, Emma, the older one, and my brother Ryan, 29 at the time, 3 years younger than me. My grandmother had written one instruction with unusual clarity. A sum of $150,000 was to be held in trust, designated for her first grandchild to marry. The funds could be used toward a wedding, a first home purchase, or any expense related to establishing a married household. The trustees were my parents, Richard and Carol. I remember sitting in that room and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at a lawyer's office. I felt loved. My grandmother had thought about my future. She had planned for it, saved for it, and written it into a legal document. I drove back to Toronto that evening, thinking about her, and I cried the whole way on the 401. My parents called me that same night. My father's voice was warm. He said, "Emma, that money is yours when the time comes. Your grandmother wanted you taken care of. Don't worry about a thing." I should have asked for a copy of the trust documents that night. I didn't. I trusted them. That was my first mistake. Fast forward to June 2023. My boyfriend Daniel proposed to me on the dock behind his parents' cottage in Muskoka. It was a Tuesday evening. The lake was completely still. He had a ring that had belonged to his late aunt, a thin gold band with a small oval sapphire, and when he got down on one knee, I laughed before I could stop myself, because I had been half expecting it and half completely unprepared, and the combination short-circuited me entirely. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The next morning, I called my parents. My mother cried. My father said, "Finally," with genuine warmth in his voice. We celebrated at their house in Barhaven, just outside Ottawa, 2 weekends later. My mother opened a bottle of Prosecco she'd been saving. My father shook Daniel's hand for a long time. It felt like the version of my family I had always wanted us to be. A week after that dinner, my mother brought up the trust fund. We were alone in the kitchen, and she said it casually, almost as an aside, that my grandmother's money was sitting there waiting, and that whenever Daniel and I were ready to start planning, they would make sure it was available. My father came in from the back porch and nodded. "It's yours," he said, "when you're ready." Daniel and I started planning in early 2024. We had been together for 4 years at that point. He was a financial advisor at a mid-size firm in Toronto. I worked in marketing for a tech company downtown. Between the 2 of us, we had managed to save $60,000 over several years, and between that and the trust, we knew we could have the wedding we had always imagined without going into debt. In March 2024, we toured 8 venues across southern Ontario. We looked at places in Niagara-on-the-Lake, 1 in Prince Edward County, 2 in the Muskokas. Then we walked into Hawthorne Estates, a property in the Halton Hills area outside of Toronto. Stone building, cedar gardens, a lantern-lit terrace that looked out over a valley. The event coordinator, a woman named Patricia, showed us the September availability. I stood on that terrace and looked at Daniel, and that was it. We knew. September 6th, 2025, 18 months away. Patricia said fall bookings at that venue went within days, and she was right. We signed the contract on March 21st, 2024. The non-refundable deposit was $9,000. Daniel and I split it from our savings. I sent my parents a photo of the venue that night. My mother texted back within minutes. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. September is perfect. We cannot wait." My brother Ryan had never worked a traditional job in his life, and I say that without judgment, or at least I try to. He was creative, restless, the kind of person who had 17 ideas before breakfast and had abandoned 16 of them by dinner. Over the years, he had launched a clothing line, a podcast about urban cycling, a meal kit delivery concept, and a consulting firm with no clients. My parents funded everything. His apartment in Vancouver was paid for. His car was paid for. When his clothing line failed, they absorbed the loss without a word. When the podcast dissolved after 8 episodes, my father simply said, "You tried something, that's what matters." I don't want to sound resentful. I had a good childhood, but there was a difference in how we were treated, and I had known it since I was old enough to notice. When I graduated from Carleton with a communications degree, my parents took me to dinner at a mid-range restaurant near campus. When Ryan got a certificate from an online business program 2 years later, my parents flew out to Vancouver, rented an Airbnb, and spent a week celebrating with him. My father said at the time, "Ryan has such a hunger for it, doesn't he?" I was in the room when he said it. In July 2024, my brother announced he had a new venture. He was launching a wellness and outdoor adventure brand, targeting the Canadian market, and he had connected with several investors and brand partners at a networking event in Whistler. He was going to attend a business development summit in Costa Rica in early September 2025, specifically to secure partnerships with outdoor lifestyle brands expanding into North America. The opportunity was, he told the family group chat, life-changing. He posted about it on Instagram. My parents commented immediately, "So proud of you. This is your moment." I didn't connect the dates at first. I was busy with work, with venue planning, with the 1,000 small decisions that a wedding generates. I sent out save the dates to 160 people in May 2024. I booked a caterer. I found my dress at a boutique in Yorkville, ivory silk, simple and structured, $2,800. I paid for it myself. Then on August 3rd, 2024, my mother called me on a Saturday morning. Her voice was careful, measured. She said, "Emma, I need to talk to you about something, and it might be a bit uncomfortable." I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee. I said, "Okay, what is it?" She told me Ryan's Costa Rica summit ran from September 1st through September 12th, 2025. She told me the registration, flights, and accommodations were non-refundable. She told me this was a critical opportunity for his brand, the kind of thing he might not get again, and then she paused. And then she said, "We were wondering if you and Daniel had considered moving the date, maybe to October, or even spring 2026. I put down my coffee cup. I reminded her that we had signed a contract 18 months earlier. I reminded her that save the dates had gone to 160 people. I reminded her that every vendor was booked and confirmed. I reminded her that the venue deposit was non-refundable. She said, "I know, sweetheart. But this is Ryan's livelihood." I said, "Mom, our wedding is in September. We are not moving it." There was a pause that lasted long enough to change the atmosphere of the conversation. Then she said, "Your father wants to talk to you about this." My father called that evening. He didn't start with a greeting. He said, "Emma, your brother has an opportunity, and family supports family." I said, "I understand that, but we planned this 18 months ago." Ryan booked his summit, knowing my wedding date. We announced the date in May. His tone shifting into something harder. "You're being rigid. This isn't how we raised you." I said, "I'm not moving my wedding date." He said, "Then we have a problem." He hung up. Daniel came home to find me sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "So they want us to throw away our deposit, rebook every vendor, ask 160 people to change their plans, and push our wedding back by months because Ryan double-booked himself." I said, "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Something doesn't add up here. Let me look into a few things." I didn't ask him what he meant. I was too tired. For 6 weeks, my parents went silent. My mother didn't answer my calls. My father's responses to texts were one word. My brother posted 3 times a week on Instagram about his upcoming Costa Rica summit. My parents liked every post. They left comments. My father wrote, "The whole family is behind you, son." My mother wrote, "We raised a winner." They did not acknowledge my wedding planning posts once. On September 18th, 2024, my mother called again. Her voice was different this time. Cooler. Formal, almost. She said, "Your father and I have talked. We'll come to the wedding. But we want you to understand that we're not happy about this. You chose your timeline over your brother's future. We'll be there because we're your parents. But don't expect us to pretend everything is fine." I asked her what that meant, practically. She said, "It means we won't be participating in toasts or family photos until you've had a conversation with Ryan and apologized for making this harder for him." I said, "I'm not apologizing for not moving my wedding date." She said, "Then you'll understand why things will be tense. Actions have consequences, Emma. Your grandmother's trust money is also something we'll need to revisit. Depending on how this plays out, your father and I need to consider our obligations as trustees." She said it like she was reading from a script. And then she hung up. I held the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. He said, "I need to show you something tonight. I've been researching the trust documents." When Daniel got home that evening, he set his laptop on the kitchen island and opened a folder. He had contacted Mr. Okafor, my grandmother's estate lawyer, who had sent him a copy of the trust documentation in his capacity as my spouse-to-be and potential beneficiary. Daniel had also, through research tools available to him through his firm, pulled together a financial picture I had not seen before. He turned the screen toward me. The trust account had held $150,000 as of January 2024. That matched what I had been told. Then Daniel pointed to a transaction dated June 12, 2024. Transfer amount: $110,000. Recipient: Ryan's corporate account. Memo: advance distribution, business establishment, family estate. I read it 3 times. Daniel said, "That transfer happened 6 weeks before your mother first called you about moving the date." I said, "They gave him the money before they even asked me to move the wedding." He said, "Yes." I stared at the screen. Ryan wasn't even the named beneficiary. The trust documents were unambiguous. The language read, "Wedding Establishment Fund of $150,000, designated for first grandchild upon marriage, to be directed by beneficiary toward wedding costs, primary residence acquisition, or marital household establishment." First grandchild was me, not Ryan. Ryan wasn't married. Ryan wasn't even engaged. Daniel pulled up another document. In Ontario, trustees of an estate have a fiduciary duty to the beneficiary. Distributing trust assets to a non-beneficiary is a breach of that duty. It is, depending on circumstances, also conversion, which is a civil wrong roughly equivalent to theft within a legal framework. He looked at me. He said, "Your parents committed fraud against your grandmother's estate." Then he showed me one more thing. He had found Ryan's Instagram posts from June 2024. On June 15th, 3 days after the transfer, Ryan had posted a photo of himself at a dealership. "New wheels, new chapter, thanks to the people who believe in me." My parents had commented within minutes. "You deserve it. $110,000, and 3 days later, a new truck." I felt very cold and very clear at the same time. Daniel closed the laptop. He said, "I've been putting something together. I want to show you at the reception. Every document, every transfer record, every Instagram post, in front of everyone." I said, "My parents will be there." He said, "I know." I said, "It will end everything." He said, "They ended it when they stole from your grandmother's estate." That night I couldn't sleep. I thought about my grandmother in her Kingston living room, her handwritten budget notebook on the coffee table, saving every dollar with the discipline of someone who had lived through scarcity and emerged with dignity. She had set that money aside for me, not for a truck, not for a summit in Costa Rica. For me, to build a life. I thought about the words my mother had used. Actions have consequences. She was right. We kept the wedding date. 3 days before the wedding, I received an email from Patricia at Hawthorne Estates with a note that she needed to clarify something. She forwarded me a chain of emails she had received. The first was dated August 4th, 2024, the day after my mother had first called me. It was from my mother, asking Patricia to outline the cancellation fees and process for moving the event to a future date. Patricia had responded that the deposit was non-refundable, and a date change would require a new contract. My mother had written back, saying this was a family matter, and she was asking on behalf of her daughter, and that surely exceptions could be made. The second email was from October 2024. My mother had written again, this time saying that the original booking had been made under emotional circumstances and that she, as the mother of the bride, was requesting that the event be flagged as potentially non-proceeding so that the venue could open the date to other clients. The third was from 2 weeks before the wedding. It said, "This wedding should not go forward as currently planned. I am the mother of the bride, and I am asking you, as a professional, to assist our family in preventing a decision our daughter will regret." Patricia had ultimately forwarded everything to me directly and said she wanted to be transparent before the event. I printed all 3 emails. I forwarded them to Daniel. He wrote back 3 words. I have them. September 6th, 2025. I woke up at 6 in the morning in the bridal suite at Hawthorne Estates. My maid of honor, my best friend since university, had slept on the pull-out in the corner and woke up when I did. She made tea on the room's small kettle and didn't say anything for a few minutes, which was exactly the right thing to do. My hair appointment was at 8. The ceremony was at 4. The reception dinner was at 6:30. At 10 in the morning, I checked my phone. My mother had sent a message at 7:45. It said, "We'll be there. Don't expect it to be easy for us." I put the phone face down on the vanity and didn't pick it up again until after the ceremony. At 2 in the afternoon, I was in my dress. My friend zipped me up. My mother was supposed to do that. She had talked about it the previous Christmas, how she'd been imagining that moment since I was small. My friend zipped me up instead, quietly, and then hugged me from behind and said, "You look unbelievable." I put on the pearl earrings my grandmother had worn at her own wedding, which my aunt had sent me after the estate was settled. They were small and simple, and I had never felt anything weigh so much in a good way. My uncle on my father's side, Thomas, knocked on the door at 3:30. He was the one who had called me 2 weeks earlier, when I had asked if he would walk me down the aisle in place of my father, who had refused unless I changed the date. Thomas had said yes without hesitation. He had said, "Your father is going to regret this for the rest of his life, and I'll tell him so directly." When he appeared in the doorway of the bridal suite in his suit, his eyes went red immediately. He offered me his arm and said, "Ready when you are." Through the window of the suite, I could see the cedar garden where guests were gathering. I could see my parents. They had chosen seats in the very last row, against the stone wall, as far from the front as they could position themselves. The 2 chairs in the front row that had been reserved for them sat empty with small name cards on them. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. The cedar garden was golden in the September light. 172 people had come. 8 who had heard about the situation beforehand had quietly sent regrets. Daniel stood at the front in a dark charcoal suit. When Thomas and I came around the path and he saw me, he exhaled, and I watched his face do something complicated and quiet and completely honest. The officiant, a woman named Reverend Carol, from a United Church in Guelph whom we'd met at a wedding fair the previous year, smiled at the crowd. She had a warm, unhurried presence. She welcomed everyone, spoke briefly about commitment and family, about chosen relationships and inherited ones. Then she reached the moment every officiant reaches. She said, "If anyone present believes there is a reason this marriage should not proceed, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." A sound moved through the crowd, like wind through grass. People turned. A woman near the front gasped audibly. My father's voice was loud enough that everyone heard him clearly. He said, "Emma, your mother and I cannot support this in good conscience. You know why. We hope someday you'll understand what you've done to this family." My mother stood beside him. She was not crying, which surprised me. She looked composed and deliberate. They walked out together down the side path. The iron garden gate opened and closed. The silence lasted a long time. Uncle Thomas, still holding my arm, leaned very close and said quietly, "Keep going, sweetheart. This is your day." I looked at Reverend Carol. I said, "Please continue." She nodded. She said, "Daniel and Emma, will you face each other?" We exchanged our vows. Daniel's hands were steady. His voice broke once, near the end, when he said, "I promise that I will always stand beside you, in front of everyone. Without exception." I felt that sentence in my chest like a key turning. Reverend Carol pronounced us married. We kissed. The crowd applauded, some of them in tears, some of them still looking toward the gate where my parents had disappeared. We took no family photos. The photographer, a woman named Julia, pulled me aside during the cocktail hour and said gently, "What would you like to do about the family portion?" I said, "Just his family." She nodded once and didn't ask again. Dinner was served at 6:30 in the stone hall. White candles in tall holders, linen tablecloths, cedar boughs running the length of the head table. 172 people eating and talking and trying to understand what they had witnessed. At the parents' table, designated by engraved cards, 2 chairs sat empty all evening. Everyone saw them. No one said anything to me directly, but I watched people glance at those chairs and then look away, and I understood what they were thinking. Daniel disappeared briefly at 8:15. He went to the AV table where the projector had been set up for a photo slideshow, connected his laptop, confirmed the display, and came back to our table. He sat down. He took my hand. He said, "Last chance." I said, "Show them everything." The toasts began at 8:30. Daniel's best man, his childhood friend, told 3 funny and 1 genuinely moving story about Daniel, and the room laughed, and then went quiet in the good way. My maid of honor talked about the decade of our friendship, about watching me become someone grounded and clear, and unwilling to be diminished, and at that point, I was holding her hand, and both of us were crying. Then the DJ said, "And now, a few words from the groom." Daniel stood up. He took the microphone. The room settled. He said, "Thank you all for being here tonight, especially those of you who stayed after what happened during the ceremony." He paused. "I want to talk about something. I'm not usually someone who makes speeches, but I am a financial advisor, and I understand documents and numbers pretty well. And today I found out something that I think everyone in this room deserves to know." He picked up a remote, and the projection screen lit up. He said, "Emma's grandmother Margaret passed away in 2022. She left a trust fund of $150,000, designated specifically for her first grandchild upon marriage. That is Emma." He clicked to the next slide. The trust document was on the screen, the beneficiary clause highlighted in yellow. He read it aloud, slowly. Then he said, "Here is what Emma's parents did with it." He clicked again. A bank statement. June 12th, 2024. Transfer, $110,000. Recipient, Ryan's corporate account. Memo. Business establishment. Family estate advance. The room made a sound I will never forget. It wasn't one gasp. It was a sustained, layered sound. Different people arriving at understanding at different speeds. Daniel let it sit. Then he continued. He said, Ryan is not engaged. Ryan is not the beneficiary of this trust. In Ontario, a trustee who distributes estate funds to someone other than the named beneficiary has breached their fiduciary duty. That is not a technicality. That is the law. He clicked again. Ryan's Instagram post from June 15th. The truck. The caption. New wheels. New chapter. My parents' comments visible underneath. He said, 3 days after the transfer, Ryan posted this. Then he clicked to Ryan's Costa Rica summit posts. He said Emma and Daniel booked their wedding on March 21st, 2024. 3 months later, Ryan registered for a summit in Costa Rica running September 1st through 12th, overlapping with the wedding date. Emma's parents then called her and asked her to move the wedding. He paused. After already giving the trust fund money to Ryan, someone in the room said, "Oh my God," clearly and without meaning to. Daniel clicked to the emails. Patricia's forwarded chain. My mother's 3 messages to the venue. He read the last one aloud. This wedding should not go forward as currently planned. Sent 2 weeks before our wedding, by Emma's mother, to our venue coordinator. Uncle Thomas, seated at table 4, stood up. He did not speak. He simply stood, looked toward the empty chairs at the parents' table, shook his head slowly, and sat back down. That gesture said more than words. Daniel moved through the final slides. The financial breakdown. The total wedding cost. What Daniel and I had each saved. What Emma's parents had contributed. 0. He said this plainly, without drama. He said, Emma's grandmother saved her entire working life to give Emma this money. Her parents took $110,000 of it and gave it to their son. Then they walked out of Emma's wedding in front of all of you. He put the microphone down. He walked to me and held out his hand. I stood. He looked at the room and said, I have complete copies of every document I've shown you tonight in 3 folders on the side table. If anyone needs them for any purpose, they're welcome to them. Then he sat down. The silence lasted about 15 seconds. Then Daniel's mother stood up and started to clap. His father followed, Uncle Thomas. My cousin from my mother's side, who I hadn't expected, stood and clapped without looking around to see if anyone else was. Then table by table the room stood, and the ovation was long and genuine. And not for us, exactly, but for something being named correctly after a long time of being unnamed. 11 people left during or shortly after the speech. My father's colleagues, a few distant relatives who had been in his orbit long enough to feel loyal to him. The rest stayed. The DJ, after a beat of professional uncertainty, put on a song and the dance floor filled with an energy I have never seen at a wedding before or since. People needed to move. People needed noise. The evening became the best party I have ever been to, not despite what had happened, but because of the release it represented. At 10:15, my cousin found me near the bar. Her eyes were red. She said, I didn't know, Emma. I want you to know that I had no idea. Your grandma would be devastated. I said. She'd be more than devastated. I think she'd be clear about what needed to happen next. My cousin nodded. She said, whatever you need, I'm with you. The last guests left at 11:30. Daniel and I were back in the bridal suite by midnight. He turned his phone on. There were 42 notifications. He scrolled through them briefly and then set the phone face down. He said, Your father called 4 times. I said, I know. He said, There's also a voicemail from a reporter at the CBC. I looked at him. He said, It's already spreading. We stayed up until 2 in the morning sitting on the small balcony, overlooking the cedar garden, talking about almost nothing. What the food had tasted like. How good the band had been before the DJ took over. Whether the flowers had turned out the way I had imagined. Normal things. Marriage things. On Monday morning I called a lawyer. Her name was Sarah Patel, and she worked in estate litigation in Toronto. A mutual connection had recommended her. I went to her office on Tuesday with every document Daniel had compiled, and she spent 90 minutes reviewing everything without speaking much. And at the end, she looked up and said, "This is a clear breach of fiduciary duty under the Trustee Act. You have a strong case. We can pursue full restoration of the trust, plus damages. In my experience with cases of this profile, they'll want to settle before discovery." She was right. The formal demand letter went out on October 3, 2025. My parents hired a lawyer. The response was defensive, citing family discretion in the management of estate assets. Sarah responded with the trust documentation, the bank records, and a letter from Mr. Okafor confirming the original intent of my grandmother's instructions. By October 24th, their lawyer had contacted Sarah to discuss settlement terms. Mediation took place on November 10th, in a neutral office building in downtown Ottawa. My parents and I were in separate rooms the entire time. The mediator, a retired judge named Mr. Akasan, moved between them. I did not see my parents once. After 3 hours, the offer came. Full restoration of the trust, $150,000, plus an additional $45,000 in damages, totaling $195,000. One condition: no further public statements. Sarah looked at me and said, "That's a very good offer," I said. "Add a written acknowledgement. I want them to put in writing what they did." 20 minutes later, the mediator returned. They agreed. The acknowledgement arrived by courier 2 weeks later. 1 page. It read, "We, Richard and Carol, acknowledge that in our capacity as trustees of the estate established by Margaret, we made a distribution of trust assets to a non-beneficiary that violated the terms of the trust and our obligations as fiduciaries. We acknowledge that Emma was the designated beneficiary of these funds and that she was harmed by our actions. We are sorry. I read it once. I put it in a filing folder. I didn't respond." The funds arrived by wire transfer on November 28th. Daniel and I bought a house in Hamilton in February 2026. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with an old maple tree, a kitchen with east-facing windows that fill with light by 7 in the morning. We put $60,000 toward the down payment and financed the rest at a rate that made our financial planner nod with quiet approval. It is the most ordinary and extraordinary thing I have ever done. Ryan's Instagram following, at its peak around 82,000, had dropped to 61,000 by December. 2 outdoor lifestyle brands that had been in partnership discussions with his company quietly withdrew. He posted less frequently. When he did post, the captions were different. Smaller. The comments from my parents, which had previously arrived within minutes, became infrequent, and then stopped appearing publicly altogether. My parents have not contacted me directly since the mediation. My Uncle Thomas calls once a month. He told me in January that my father had lost 3 major fleet accounts at the dealership, clients who had read the coverage in the Ottawa Citizen and decided they preferred to do business elsewhere. He told me my father had asked about me. He told me my father had said he wanted to reach out. I told Thomas that reaching out was his choice to make, and that when and if he made it, I would decide what to do with it. But that it would need to be more than a phone call. It would need to be honest. And it would need to start with him understanding what he actually did, not a version of it that was easier to carry. Thomas said, "I'll tell him." I said, "Thank you for walking me down the aisle." He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the most important walk I've ever taken." I'm sitting in the east-facing kitchen right now as I write this. The maple in the backyard is starting to come back after the winter. Small leaves just beginning. That particular green that only lasts a week in early spring before it deepens. Daniel is in the next room on a work call. We are 8 weeks away from the due date. My grandmother saved her entire life to make sure I could build something real. It took longer to reach me than it was supposed to, and it came through a harder path than anyone would have chosen. But it got here, and we built something with it. Something that belongs to us, fully and without condition. If you're watching this and someone in your family is using money to control you, or using guilt to silence you, or using the word humility to mean submission, write everything down. Keep every text message. Save every email. Know that in most provinces in this country, if you are the named beneficiary of an estate, there is a legal framework protecting your rights, and there are lawyers who will take your case. And know that the family you build, the one you choose deliberately and maintain with honesty, will hold you in ways the family you were born into sometimes cannot. That's not a tragedy. It's just a different kind of love. Quieter, maybe, but it holds.